Thank you, Mr. Toastmaster. Fellow Toastmasters, honored guests. Changes are coming to America. In my previous speech, I talked about these changes. We have a warning from the past. Remember the story of the Great Depression? You may remember from 1920 to 1925, the stock market doubled. From 1927 to 1929, it doubled again. That particular peak is known as a melt-up. The melt-up term was coined about 3 years ago by a researcher named Dr. Steve Sugarud, and it's since been used widely throughout the financial industry. You'll notice what happened when the melt-up peaked. There was a sudden drop. Some would call it a crash. Then in the 1930s, once it reached the bottom, you'll note it came up again, significantly, a 350% rally in the stock market. Now consider today's situation. We had a peak in 2008. And then we had what's termed the Great Recession. There was a crash. A lot of people lost their jobs, but the stock market went back up. It's been up for 10 years. And it's been up more than 250% and continues to go up. We're seeing the past repeating itself. And yet, for all that, more Americans are getting poorer. Now, I like what's been done in the last year or so by President Trump. More people have come to work. There's more jobs. But you take a look at the very wealthy have done very well. And yet, others, ordinary workers, the middle wage workers, haven't gained anything, and the poor have actually lost in terms of purchasing power. And here's the secret. The underlying cause of all this is that wages are no longer connected to productivity. If you go back to the halcyon sublime days of 1950, in those days, when worker productivity went up, worker wages went up commensurately. But then something happened in 1971. Can anyone guess what it was?
Off the gold standard.
We went off the gold standard, yes. There was a ship in New York Harbor sent by the French to exchange dollars for literally tons of gold. And President Nixon said, we're off the gold standard. And since then, money has not been the same. We've seen productivity go up, but wages have not gone up commensurately, the purchasing power of wages. And look what's happened since then. Since then, we have debt. This is student debt. It's now sitting at $1.5 trillion. There's more debt. As you know, government debt is more than $20 trillion. Besides the student loan, even consumer debts. Ordinary household, ordinary working people, $3.9 trillion. And if you think that's bad in the United States, consider Western Europe. They're in worse shape than the United States in terms of debt. Japan is in worse shape than Western Europe. And even China has a government debt that exceeds 100% of its gross domestic product. In other words, the world is loaded with debt. Debt that can never be repaid. And we have an upcoming presidential election in 2020. That's 49 years to the day going off the gold standard. And since then, our total debt in the United States has risen from 100% of our gross domestic product to now it's 400%. And here's the thing. Millennials now exceed boomers in terms of voting numbers. And millennials have a trend toward accepting socialism. That means that socialist politicians have made promises. If you read the news, you know what they are. Student debt can be reduced or even wiped off. Higher minimum wage for everybody. Free college tuition, that's a biggie. Medicare for everyone, have you heard that phrase? Yes, it's going around. Basic income for all. Everybody gets a check monthly from the government. And finally, Even in our universities, some people are starting to talk about a jubilee in which all debt will be canceled. Remember Venezuela? Does socialism work? Today, in Venezuela, the inflation rate is 100,000%. Prices double every week. Most people are out of work. The average citizen has lost 20 pounds. They don't have enough to eat. There's a shortage of everything. Many Venezuelans have moved to Colombia or Brazil. And in America, we're going down a similar path. If we do what they did, the stock market will collapse. People will be out of work. There'll be dozens of companies that will be bankrupt. Millions of people will be affected. Everybody. You'll know everybody. Everyone in your family will be affected. Now, is there a way? Is there a way to avoid all this? Well, there's a broad light. This is a possible future. There's one possibility. It doesn't have to happen. The Z generation will actually outnumber the millennials in 2019. So hopefully the younger people will not take to socialism. But if they do, there are some ways to escape this. First of all, you could open a foreign bank account. Many rich people have done this. Some even have sublime houses in other countries. But Paul Manafort has recently taught us a lesson. You can have a foreign bank account, but if you derive income, you should report it on your taxes if you live in this country. Now, if you live outside this country like George Soros, they can't reach you. Then there's another way to do it is to buy a little bit of land. Land may lose its value somewhat, but it also retains some value. And the same thing is true for gold and silver. Now, if you go to a financial consultant, they'll tell you gold and silver are down. They're down. They've hit a low. But it's a great time to buy. I think of it as bargain buying. Put 10% of your assets into gold or silver, and that's an insurance policy. Because gold and silver will never decrease to nothing. Your stocks may. And finally, sell stocks when you see a warning sign. You may wonder, what warning sign? Your short-term interest exceeds long-term interest. Yes, that's a warning sign. If you buy a long-term treasury note, you should have higher interest than a short-term note. But when that switches, basically that's a warning. A crash is coming. It may be a few weeks, it may be 6 months, but it's coming soon. So those are things to think about and prepare for yourself and your family. Mr. Toastmaster.